kings, this he said to me. The greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return. Then one day, a magic day, he passed my way. While we spoke of many things, fools and kings, this he said to me. The greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return. Chip Crawford on piano. Siempre que te pregunto que cuándo, cómo y dónde, tú siempre me respondes, quizás, quizás, quizás. Y así pasan los días y yo desesperado y tú contestando, quizás, quizás, quizás. Estás perdiendo el tiempo pensando, pensando por lo que más tú quieras. ¿Hasta cuándo? ¿Hasta cuándo? Y así pasan los días y yo desesperado y tú contestando, quizás, quizás, quizás. Estás perdiendo el tiempo pensando, pensando por lo que más tú quieras. ¿Hasta cuándo? ¿Hasta cuándo? Y así pasan los días y yo desesperado y tú contestando, quizás, quizás, And so we sing about Sweet Lorraine. Well, I've just found joy. I'm as happy as a baby boy with another brand new choo-choo toy. When I met my sweet Lorraine, Lorraine, Lorraine. She's got a pair of eyes that are brighter than the summer sky. When you see them, you'll realize why I love my sweet Lorraine. Now when it's raining, I don't miss the sun, because it's in my baby's smile. To think that I'm the lucky one that will lead her down the aisle. Each night I pray no one will steal her heart away. I can't wait until that lucky day when I marry sweet Lorraine. Now when it's raining, I don't miss the sun, because it's in my baby's smile. To think that I'm the lucky one that will lead her down the aisle. Each night I pray that no one will steal her heart away. I can wait until that lucky day when I marry sweet Lorraine. Thank you so much.
touch my loneliness, sweeping my blues up and knocking them down. I want the feeling of jazz, 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 jazz.
Good afternoon, everyone. Wonderful. We'll let other folks come in and get settled, get seated. My name is Doretha Williams. I serve as the director for the Robert F. Smith Center for the Digitization and Curation of African American History. We welcome you to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We have a wonderful program this afternoon highlighting a fabulous historian and author as part of our Family History Center's programs on genealogy. Dr. Martha Jones is a writer, historian, legal scholar, and public intellectual whose work aims to understanding the politics, culture, and poetics of Black America. Her latest book, The Trouble of Color, an American Family Memoir, recounts her family's encounters with race and color through the story of 5 generations. She is the author of prize-winning histories that survey the vast American past, from slavery and the founding, the Civil War and Reconstruction, women's suffrage and Jim Crow, on through the modern civil rights and present-day race and identity. Book included in this list is Vanguard, How Black Women Brokered Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All and Birthright Citizenship, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America. For the New York Times, she has written on culture and travel. Her opinion columns have appeared in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Politico, Talking Points Memo, and USA Today. You can see her and hear her on outlets such as NPR's Here and Now and CNN's Amanpour. Her work has enjoyed generous recognition, including book prizes from the American Historical Association, the Organization for American History, the Society for Legal History, and the Los Angeles Times and Fellowship's Berlin's Institute for Advanced Study, and the National Humanities Center. At Johns Hopkins University, Dr. Jones teaches for the Department of History and the SNF Agora Institute and is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor. She also directs the Hard Histories at Hopkins Project, where her lab investigates the history of slavery and racism connected with Johns Hopkins University and medicine. Please welcome to the podium Dr. Martha Jones.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank Doretha Williams, Edwina Parks, who's here up front, and everybody here at the museum for welcoming me and welcoming a conversation about this book. You all know what an honor it is to be in this place among these extraordinary colleagues who do so much for our history and culture every day. It means a great deal to be here with them, but also with you, friends, visitors, members, everybody who's made me so welcome today, so thank you. I'm going to share some from my book, The Trouble of Color, today, and I'm going to tell three stories, in essence, all that turn on the question of marriage and family and how the color line has, in my story, shaped, distorted, thwarted, and otherwise troubled how it is that we have made family over time. My book overall is a meditation on family, but also on a often quoted line from W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. You know it. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. But in this book, I wanted to really think with Du Bois, but also think beyond Du Bois, in the sense that I think sometimes his metaphor comes to us as the notion of a division between Americans that was set, that was sure, that was indelible, that was rarely crossed. And in The Trouble of Color, I come to think of that color line as jagged, as a place that is uneven, a place that is dangerous even for those of us who come close to it, get too close to it. I'm going to start with me. This is June 13th, 1967. The New York Times is reporting a U.S. Supreme Court decision in the case of Loving versus Virginia. Loving is that Supreme Court decision that finally knocks down the last pillar of Jim Crow segregation in the U.S., that is the prohibition in 18 states of the prohibition against marriage across the color line, interracial marriage, or so-called miscegenation. Loving versus Virginia marks a watershed moment for the nation and for civil rights, but it also marks an important transformation for families, including the family I come from. And what I mean by that is I had parents who had married in 1957, 10 years before Loving, had married across the color line. He was so-called black and she was so-called white. And I grew up, I think, with a kind of stigma, a kind of shame, a sense that our family didn't fit with the American story, that our family was aberrant, that it was outside the bounds of the American story. And the trouble of color and taking a longer look at our own family story let me rethink some of those assumptions that I had grown up with and lived with for a very long time. So I'm going to tell 3 stories, all of which are set many, many, many decades before this moment in 1967, in the beginnings of the 19th century, with my 2 of my great-great-grandmothers. I'll introduce you to Mary and to Isabella, and then a 3rd character, a political figure, but also a novelist, Albion Tourgée. All of them, in their own way, long before we get to this moment in 1967, generations before we get to 1967, are already wrestling with the color line and what it means for marriage and family. Mary, as you'll hear, is someone who faces the color line and faces down the color line by way of subterfuge in an effort to make her family. Isabella, on the other hand, also confronts the color line, but for her it is a site of unmitigated violence and of sexual assault. She makes a family despite the color line. And then finally, Albion Tourgée, the jurist turned novelist, who in the same moment, in the same scene, here we are in central North Carolina in the 19th century, Albion Tourgée is the novelist who also asks questions about women like Mary and Isabella, about the families they make. But as we'll hear, Tourgée really romanticizes that story in an effort to, I hope you'll agree, in an effort to imagine a better kind of future. So first, Mary. Mary married Elijah Jones in 1827. Elijah was a free man of color in central North Carolina, in Caswell and Orange counties, and his bride was Mary Haith, someone whom family lore tells me that someone who began her life as a so-called white woman. I don't know how they met or how they chose each other, but I do know that in 1827, Elijah appeared before a court clerk in his local county. He stepped forward to procure a marriage license. This is the bond document that resulted. In this, he agreed, promised, along with a neighbor, to pay $1,000 bond if there was any reason that his marriage to Mary was in any way contrary to law. Well, it was. But marriage promised benefits to Mary and Elijah. Their children would be legitimate, entitled to inheritance rights. But lawmakers in North Carolina had other ideas about couples like Mary and Elijah. In 1821, lawmakers wrote, "Free people of color could not testify against so-called white persons." And very soon after that, in the very year that Mary and Elijah marry, they prohibit so-called people of color from marrying white persons. North Carolina is drawing the color line in these laws about race and marriage. They were not deterred, as this document tells us. They got their license, they filed their bond, and they married. I wish I could tell you where and what. I like to think it was a happy occasion. It was certainly a solemn one, as they promised themselves to one another. But when Mary promised to marry Elijah, one of the things she did was give up her past. She abandoned her family name. That was fairly typical in the 19th century. But she also gave up any discernible ties to her whiteness. 3 years later, in 1830, when the census taker came to visit their household, Mary and Elijah met with him, reported on their family. They now had 2 small children, but they also reported Mary, and the details are less important than the columns. Mary is recorded as a free colored person along with Elijah. This is Mary's subterfuge. This is her way of ensuring that her family is protected from the scourge of anti-miscegenation laws, protecting she and Elijah from the charge of fornication or sex outside of marriage, insulating them from the charge of bastardy, a charge that was leveled against couples in this period who had children outside of marriage. And so Mary's subterfuge, becoming, in essence, a woman of color in this moment, is part of how she makes a family. And the story continues. In 1840, once again, Mary is a free person of color on the US Census. And by 1850, now the color line is shifting. And no longer do census takers account for free people of color and so-called white persons. New categories have emerged. And Mary and Elijah in 1850, when Mary confronts the census taker, she is now M, as you can see in that third long column, the M for the term mulatto. A pseudo-scientific, a pseudo-race science term now that is going to haunt but also cover up the subterfuge that Mary and Elijah have been engaging in for a long time. This is one of those moments when you're writing a family history when you come to a seemingly official and ministerial style document like a census return, and you're trying to fill out the scene and understand what happened here. Mary at home, anticipating the census taker. His appearance was noticed in the local papers. He would have walked or come by horse or by carriage and gone house to house throughout their community over the weeks of the summer of 1850. She knew that when he arrived, he would not only have questions about who was in the household, parents, children, elders, etc. They would have questions about age and occupation. Elijah was a shoemaker. But the census taker would also be sizing her up to give her a color label. And here you can see, I think in a sense, Mary succeeds, right? Because she's able to persuade, if you will, the census taker that she, like Elijah, is a mixed race woman or mulatto, and she is someone to whom he can indeed be married. Subterfuge. Isabella, my great-great-grandmother on the other side, had her own kind of confrontation with the color line in the very same years. Isabella was born early in the 19th century, enslaved in eastern North Carolina, likely in Bertie County. This is an image of Bandon, the plantation on which she was enslaved for much of her early life. Isabella comes to Greensboro, not far from where Mary and Elijah are settled, after the Civil War. only after slavery has been abolished in North Carolina and throughout the U.S. And she comes by way of a bargain. She has negotiated with the man who is the father of her children and arranged that she will migrate west to Greensboro. They've agreed that once she settles there, he will purchase her a lot and a house, and this will be the foundation of her new life as a free woman. That man, the father of her 9 children, 4 surviving, was also the man who called her property. And so Isabella's confrontation with that jagged color line happens over the course of many years here at Bandon, where she is subject to the sexual demands of the man who calls her property, the man who fathers her children. I first met Isabella here in the records of the Freedmen's Bureau. In 1867, after she had settled in Greensboro, she comes before first a court clerk and then before federal officials to tell her story, not simply to get it recorded, but to complain, because William Holly, the man who has fathered her children, that man with whom she had made a bargain, has reneged on their bargain, and she is destitute. She explains to the Freedmen's Bureau that she had lived with Holly, she had labored for Holly, she had borne Holly's children, he had promised her, and then not made good on that promise. She appeals to federal officials there in Greensboro to compel Holly to make good on his promise. And first here a court clerk, and then the Freedmen's Bureau official records make a record of the complaint, a complaint that's sent to William Holly seeking his satisfaction. What I want us to notice on this document is, if you can see it in the far left column there, there's a single word written on an angle. And this is the Freedmen's Bureau conclusion about Isabella, her relationship to William Holly, and their encounter across the color line. The word is bastardy. Now, Isabella's complaint certainly constituted, at least to my civilian's eye, a breach of promise or a breach of contract. It may indeed have been a complaint that embodied a charge of sexual assault or rape. But for the Freedmen's Bureau, it turns out the only offense in those encounters, those long years of encounters between William Holly and Isabella, the only offense is that of bastardy. The only victim in this reading is the state of North Carolina, which has not been offered a guarantee or a bond for the 4 children of Isabella's that have survived, children born outside of marriage. It turns out, in the eyes of the Freedmen's Bureau, not only William Holly, but Isabella herself has committed a crime. Here we appreciate, I hope, the ways in which Isabella's story helps us to think about the not only the vagaries of the color line, but the danger that lies along it for her. So my last short story is about another man, also part of this extraordinary scene in the 1860s and 1870s in central North Carolina, in the Piedmont, in the city of Greensboro, and that is Albion Tourgée. Tourgée was a Union veteran who, from the North, who, like many so-called carpetbaggers, makes his way to Greensboro in North Carolina after the war. He's looking to establish himself in business. He's looking to establish himself in politics. He does better at the latter than he does the former. But perhaps most unexpectedly, Tourgée, in addition to being a Republican Party activist, in addition to running his own farm, Tourgée emerges as a writer, and a prolific one. And these are the original bindings of his books. The most famous of his books is A Fool's Errand, but I want to talk about, just briefly today, his first book, oftentimes overlooked, his novel called Toinette. So Tourgée is in North Carolina. He's in Greensboro. He's in the world that people like Mary and Elijah and Isabella are occupying, the world in which people like Mary, Elijah, and Isabella and others, scores of them, dozens of them, hundreds of them, are settling in Greensboro, building homes, churches, communities, schools, and Tourgée is very much a part of this Reconstruction era scene in North Carolina. He is observing it. He is a political ally to Black men who are deep in the struggle for freedom, but more importantly, by the 1870s for civil rights. And he begins to write novels that draw very much on the people he meets and the stories that they tell him. And Toinette is the very first story he pens. And Toinette is in the end, I think, a romantic telling of the lives of women like Isabella in particular. Toinette is an enslaved woman, a young enslaved woman, beautiful, fair-skinned, pious, chaste, who begins a romantic relationship with the man who is also her owner. Toinette bears a child, and they seem to be born into a troubled world, a world in which the color line, including North Carolina's anti-miscegenation laws, make it impossible for Toinette and her owner to imagine a life together as family, as husband and wife, as parents to their child. But with the war's end, as Tourgée tells the story, the world turns. And the world turns not only by wiping away anti-miscegenation laws in North Carolina in Tourgée's imagination, but now permitting Toinette, her former owner, and their child to be wholly and fully a family by bonds of affection, but also by the letter of the law. Tourgée's story, I think, for us is, on the one hand, reflects his own fascination and somewhat, I think, pernicious fascination with the intimate lives and the histories of women like Isabella and Mary. But it also is a vision for a kind of future, a future in which the color line falls away, a future in which anti-miscegenation laws are no more. It is the kind of political future that someone like Tourgée is at least putting forward to North Carolinians and his readers generally. Perhaps not surprising, Toinette is not well received on the pages of North Carolina's newspapers. Tourgée is vilified for suggesting that white men had any sort of intimate or sexual desire for Black women, but as importantly, Tourgée is vilified for suggesting that white men are the perpetrators in those intimate relationships. He too, in his own way, experiences the scourge of the color line. He is politically, as well as in a literary sense, very much discredited in this period. So I've told these three stories in part because I wanted to share with you a sense of where a journey into family history has taken me. This book begins with a vignette, an encounter I had many, many years ago with a classmate in a Black Studies class who asks me, "Who do you think you are? What are you doing here in front of a Black Studies class speaking about a great intellectual, in this case, the great Frantz Fanon?" was my assignment that day. But that question, I think, settled in and really took hold of me. And this book reflects my journey and my quest to really answer that question, not in a quip or in a smart answer back, but the real answer about who I am, about who so many of us are, can be found in the stories of the families that we come from. I was raised in a household, as I said at the outset, in which my parents' own marriage, I was told again and again, was illicit, and it was in many states. It was irregular, as it was in a cultural sense, and that we, as their children, were also outside the bounds of any known American story. And I think I might have lived for the rest of my days with that characterization of us until I was able to go back and recover the story of Mary, who it turns out is perhaps the first white woman, but not the last on our family tree. Mary, someone who uses the subterfuge to negotiate and manage the problem of the color line for her family with Elijah. If I hadn't understood the story of Isabella, whose own encounter with the color line and with William Holly also very much explains who I am and who we are today. And then there's Albion Tourgée, who in his own way is wanting to remind us that another world is possible, another way is possible, that the color line is not a permanent feature of our world. It is one that can be challenged, and it's one that can be undone. I think for me, in writing this book, there's a revelation, and it's a revelation, I think, not only about my own family, but about these American families historically, and about who we are today as an American family. You know, I think I was, maybe like many of you, when I was introduced to family history, I was introduced to the metaphor of the tree, you know, the tree with the great branches, and we fill it out, and it is orderly, and it is stately. And I've begun to think that there's something misleading about the tree metaphor, that maybe families are really more like vines, and they are twisted and overlapping and complicated, double back on themselves, that our American families that do not comport with pure bloodlines or stately branches on a trunk, that our families are perhaps the main story in American history, that our families, with their complexities, with their subterfuge, with their violence, and even with their dreams for a kind of utopia beyond the color line, are indeed the main story of American history rather than its sidebar. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much, and I'm eager for questions and comments and anything else. Thank you all. Folks are going to make their way. I see the great Alelia Bundles making her way to the microphone.
Martha, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
It's just such a really important book and dealing with really complicated stories. So, like you, I write about family, and I sometimes write about complicated things, but when I was reading this book, I was thinking how, there's joy that you find, but there are a lot of really difficult questions that you're grappling with. And in your research process, you talk about going to various historical societies and sometimes getting what you needed and sometimes not. So I'm just curious if you take us a bit through that research process.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for your model. Alelia Bundles knows that she is a beacon for those of us who dare to step into family history and insist that our families are part of American history. So thank you for that. And you are right that in the journey to writing this book, I ventured to places I'd never been, like central Kentucky, which is where my grandmother's people are from. And along the way, indeed, I met people who I think would have rather I never showed up, let's put it that way. And in central Kentucky, I met a librarian who whom I had to insist, I guess, that she try and help me untangle the story of my grandmother's family and their relationship to the family that had once called them property in central Kentucky. And when I insisted, she said to me, in essence, be careful. Be careful who you talk to about this. And I hear that. I hear two things in that. On the one hand, I think she understood that I was out of my depths, which is to say, I was in central Kentucky poking around, cemeteries and neighborhoods and archives and the courthouse, and no one there knew me, and I really knew no one there, and that I should take care because my questions might not be welcome. But of course, the other side of that coin is that she was concerned that I was asking questions about families whose stories, and I should say white families, whose stories really are the pillars of this small town in central Kentucky. And my questions, even if I didn't have answers for them, my questions were enough to unsettle something like the social order to the degree that it rests on history and on the reputations of so-called distinguished families. And so, again and again, I think it's true, what I learned from that is how present our past is, right? That the past is not some remote place that we dig around in some musty, dusty, shoebox or suitcase and tell charming stories about, but that history and family history is very much the foundation of who we understand ourselves to be today. So I hope the book is not only a testament to that, the book is a reminder that when we go searching, when we make the discoveries, such as that discovery of Isabella's complaint to the Freedmen's Bureau and her abuse by William Holly, even in our own families, there are generations and individuals who would rather we didn't tell those stories. And in my family, Isabella's story was, in essence, a secret until a wonderful cousin in California found this document and shared it with me. And now I tell you that story here. So thank you for that. And I think it's a caution on many levels about the work that we do. And how different it feels to do it, not at home in front of your computer, in the safety of your own dining room as you're scrolling through census records, but the different sort of challenge about facing people in the world and still trying to tell those stories. So thanks. Hi.
First of all, let me say I'm nervous. But anyway.
Me too, but thank you for being here.
I am a fourth or fifth generation Charleston, South Carolina individual. We just finished recently doing our family history, tracing it back as far as a guy whose name was Charles Macbeth, who was the mayor of Charleston, South Carolina, when South Carolina seceded from the Union. And I will also admit that when you first stood at the podium, I will admit that I said to myself, wow, why is a white woman writing this book about the color situation? Although half of my friends in Charleston, in fact, looked exactly like you because of the lineage, and very many of my aunties also looked exactly like you, because of that lineage. So I really am interested in your book. I'm glad you wrote it. It parallels so much of not only my history, but I'm sure the history of very many African Americans, colored, black, or whatever it is people choose to call themselves. As a result of that, I have determined many years ago to stop checking the black box, and also having read Lewis Henry Gates' book on the black box, because I felt that race is really a sociological creation, actually, to create exactly what it did, put white folks on the top and then move on down. So I guess I say all of that just to say that the whole history is so important to us, and the dynamics of it and how it impacts family relations, friendships, and everything else like that. And now, instead of checking black on the box, I also check, I put on the other line, human. I lived in Miami for years and had several Hispanics, of course, down there, when I would not check black, and I would check the H box, they would start speaking to me in Spanish. And I would say, I'm not Spanish. And they would say, well, you check the H box. And I would say, no, that stands for human, because that is exactly what I am. So I apologize for my initial reaction to you. I really appreciate all that you said about this, because to me, it is the whole discussion that you have in your book is driving not only our individual sense of who we are, but it's also driving our identity and who it is that we make, connections with, and we choose to, and be involved in causes and everything else that relate to that. So thank you very much, and my apologies again.
Thank you. Yes, and I think it's important to say no apologies, right? We're here for the conversation and for the discussion and the questions, so I thank you so much for that. I am, in this book, very interested in the boxes and the categories and the way in which they shift over time. How, for example, Mary and Elijah go from being free people of color to mulattoes and so forth. But part of what I began to understand is that a census return, in some ways, is no more or no less than just another story. It's just a story, right, about a man who came with a set of questions prescribed to him in those years by Congress, and he asked some questions, he sized people up, and he told a story on that form about what he thought he saw. What we can say is that Mary tricked his eye, and was probably very relieved to have done so. But that to not give the boxes and the folks who create the boxes and the folks who fill in the boxes the last word or the only word about who we are and how we understand ourselves, I think is part of where this book goes for me. It might amuse you to know that on my birth certificate, my mother and I were both marked as, my parents were both marked as white. even though my father is not. And what to do about that storyteller, a physician who filled out boxes, and you'll see how I do in the book, but I'm interested in animating those kinds of forms and helping us see that they're a product of human observation, human misunderstanding, and more. They might be sociological facts, but they're not equivalent to the facts of who we are, or who we know ourselves to be all the time. So thank you so much for that. I'm so glad you're here. Hi.
Hi. Let me say first, thank you for some of your earlier work, which filled in a piece of my family history that I didn't know in a law review article, Jackson v. Hughes.
Oh my God.
And so I'll just say that. Also, I have another story which is in the category of secrets. It's a little complicated, so I'll tell that at a different time. And finally, I'm currently reading a book called The Invention of the Jewish People by Shlomo Sand, which is, I think, related very much to what you're talking about here. And I recommend it to everybody. And that's all I'll say. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. I think one of the remarkable things about talking about this book in bookstores and in libraries is that I hear lots of family stories, and sometimes we share them privately, sometimes folks share them at the microphone, but what I didn't anticipate were the ways in which many, many Americans would see a version of their story in our story. That is to say, I had one person who said to me, you know, I'm Jewish American, but my mother is a Ashkenazi Jew from Eastern Europe, and my father is a Sephardic Jew from the Middle East. And in my family, that was trouble. That was trouble. You know, my parents would say that color was one problem in their life and in their effort to make a family, but my father was Methodist and my mother was Catholic. And in 1957, that was as different as Americans got in some quarters. So I'm hearing, you know, Americans unpacking their own family stories from many perspectives, and very few of us claim some kind of simple, pure, direct kind of lineage. That instead, the joys and the beauty, but also the challenges and troubles in our family are oftentimes around the perception that somehow our complicated families aren't American families, that they're somehow outside the norm, and I think they're not. So thank you for that. Hello.
I think I'm up. Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Can I call you Martha? I've been following you online for several months, Martha. Dr. Jones.
I think Martha is just fine any
you.
day, but especially today, so thank you.
So I first met you at I'm a Hopkins grad, so a prouder Johns Hopkins grad came out of there 25 years ago. I think you're probably the second tenured black professor since I've been out of there. I don't know if there were any ones before you, so that is a big deal for me. And a personal story, I was drawn to you because you remind me of my aunt. You look kind of just like her, same complexion. And so John Green, who is our Black Alumni Network president, I sent him a message, hey, John, Dr. Jones, do you know what her background is? John's a black man. We couldn't quite say the word.
This is the polite version of the "Who do you think you are?" question.
This is for what's mixed audiences, because John and I were saying, John, tell me. He says, Daryl. He wouldn't say it. He said, Daryl, I think she is. So okay, gotcha. So I started listening to you, and I knew, okay, she's black, and because back in the 50s, growing up in segregated Cleveland, East side was black, west side was white. The words were, if you're black, don't get your ass caught on the west side.
Those were the words. And so my aunt was your complexion. All the best butcher shops were on the west side. The worst cuts of meat were on the east side. So all of our mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles would give my Aunt Margaret the butcher order. She'd take the streetcar over to the west side. I'm thinking, what's the business purpose of selling crappy meat to these people and the best meat over here? Isn't the money all the same?
Yeah.
That's a 10-year-old trying to make sense out of this. But I always wondered, the fear, I was always afraid of the west side, the fear that she had to experience going over there, impersonating, I always wondered what would happen if she got caught. So the benefits were great. We got the best choice cuts of meat before anybody else. And I'm just curious as to, have you had experiences where that ambiguity served you? I missed the first part of your lecture, so if you shared that. Any other stories? I'm not advocating it. I think I've chosen the hard walk. Can't pass, but sometimes people confuse. They say, hey, Angie, there's some white guy on the phone wanting to talk to you. I'm thinking, they think I'm white? What is this? So there's confusion all the way around, but I've had those reactions that I wasn't black enough. So just talking, babbling, but whatever you want to react to. Nice to meet you.
Well, thank you for that, especially for your telling me about your exchange with John Gass. I really appreciate. It's really good to know that those conversations still go on. I think that partly in this book, the last chapter is about my own father, who I think, I wouldn't say passes toward the end of his life, but I do think he gives up the effort to correct people when they misapprehend him, right? That I think he suffers from a kind of exhaustion around the dynamics of the color line. And I appreciate that as his experience. And I think in some ways he subscribed, to the H is human box in his spirit and in his soul. And there's no doubt that, where was I? I don't know. I was in the train station, buying a bottle of water. If I allow myself, I could ask myself every time I have that sort of encounter, is the clerk polite to me or politer to me because she perceives me to be a white woman? Can I inflect myself just enough so she recognizes me as not? And I can't say that I spend every day policing the world and setting the world straight. I think if I did that, I wouldn't get much work done at all. I think that would be a full-time job. But at the same time, of course, I live a life in which I am aware of and vividly aware of the way in which color and colorism shapes my experience, results in sets of experiences, encounters, assaults, and more that I don't experience. I had it's many years ago now, but a cousin and I took her son and a friend of his. They were preteen boys, but they were tall and brown-skinned, and we took them for a long weekend to Martha's Vineyard. And we used to get in the car in New York late at night, and we would drive overnight so that we could be at the first ferry at dawn in Massachusetts. And we came over the bridge into Rhode Island, and I'm a conservative driver. My husband's here, so I'm just making sure he's not guffawing. I am a conservative driver, at least on that night. And we got onto the plaza. You know how it is, the floodlights kind of fill the car, and the police are observing, and they pull me over. And the officer, my license, registration, nothing remarkable. He gives me back my license and registration. And he says, "Thank you, I pulled you over for your own safety." And now I understand what has happened, right? That we're in the car, and he thinks I'm a white woman in a car with 3 black people, including 2 young men in the back, and he's pulling me over to make sure that I'm okay. And in that moment, I might have replied to him, you know, "Who do you think you are? You're mistaken, sir." But I thought, oh no, I have 2 boys in the back of my car, and so I'm going to roll up my window and we are going to drive away because this is not a safe place for us. And so I share that just to say that I've thought a lot about this, and I think it doesn't cut one way. That sometimes maybe I am the person, not literally, who goes across town to see the butcher, though if there was a good butcher, I would go across town in Baltimore. I tell you I would. Not quite so intentionally, but unintentionally, I think there are moments in which my appearance cuts in ways that are complicated but important. Yeah. Thank you. Hi.
Hey, Dr. Jones. I am a friend of your sister, and she and I used to work together at the Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York City. And my first real encounter with her was we were having a meeting of the employees of color, and your sister walked in. And I thought, why is she here? But she worked for HR, so I said, oh, yeah, that must be it. And then somewhere in the conversation, she said, and as a woman of color, and I was like, what color? But she and I have since become quite good friends, and in fact, the reason why I got your book was she and I are in a virtual book club together, and she told all of us, she just raved about the book. And so as soon as it came out, I got it. But my question to you, one, knowing your sister and seeing all of your accomplishments, and it's kind of in the vein of the last question, where while people misidentify you guys all the time, you are very insistent and solid in your own personal identification. My question to you is how? How do you do it?
So thank you for that. And you're not the first person my sister has sent to an event, so I hope you'll give me a good review. I don't know. My goodness.
Your sister is your biggest fan.
My goodness. And I don't know what her answer would be, because we're just 4 years apart, but sometimes in a family 4 years is significant. So I'm born in Central Harlem, and my first memories are of being a child in Central Harlem, where I think my mother really was the only white person sort of in the circle of neighbors and friends and family. And so I didn't have questions, if one has questions as a small child about who I was. Our mother's family, in essence, abandoned us when she married my father, so we didn't know them. And so we were raised in an extended black family of grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins. So in the conscious, unconscious of a child, I think I knew who I was or who my people were, put it that way. We moved to the suburbs when my sister's born. And so, and then I learned something new, and it's called racism, because we move into a previously all-white enclave, and despite efforts to keep us from moving in, and my parents are social pariahs, and there are yards I'm not invited into. I understand now in a new way what it is to be Black, right, which is to be excluded, which is to be, denigrated, which is, I know racism. And, I think I'm very much a child of the one-drop rule. It's my students in the 1990s and in the 21st century who teach me things like mixed race and biracial and even white presenting. These are 21st century ideas, important ones. And I'm not hostile to them, but if you ask me who I am in my psyche, I'm a child of the one-drop rule. I don't think anybody would have let us be white for a minute if we had been so presumptuous to suggest that we were. It's never been a question for me as a matter of my own sense of self, but it is also true that my sense of self has very much been shaped by others people's questions, queries, and more about who I am. Yeah. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. Hello.
Hello. I'm so excited to read your book. I think it's such an interesting perspective. And even as we sit here watching this social interaction where you are, just your presence, right, is bringing up all of these other issues around race. One of the things you were talking about was the story of being challenged in your Black history class. And what I thought I heard you say was you were working on an assignment from Fanon.
It was. Isn't that ridiculous?
It's just, can you talk a bit about how his perspective has shaped not only your worldview, but how you respond to this social interaction?
Sure. I mean, so my assignment in this class was Frantz Fanon's Dying Colonialism, and part of what my classmate says is, to the professor, she doesn't even know where the French Antilles are, right? He really, and he was right. I had no idea. But I'm not going to apologize for that because I was a freshman in college and I was there to learn. But of course, as I read Fanon, and I read him with a kind of appreciation for his sort of naming, right? For naming for teaching, but also naming and teaching us, the wounds, the scars, the damage of racism for Black people, right? Fanon is teaching me that Blackness is not only an American question, it is a question for the globe, it is a question for France and for the Caribbean and for North Africa and on and on. And so I feel very lucky in a way, that if it was 1966, there might not have been a Black Studies program at all. But by 1976, there is. And so many of the questions I have about myself, about my family, but about the world are right on the table in Black Studies. And the classmate who challenges me becomes a friend, and we learn together a lot of things, including about one another. But the important piece for me is that I came of age at a time when Black thought, Black theory, Black history, Black literature is literally being republished and available and part of our curriculum. And I think I needed that. I think I needed that as part of my own coming of age. And of course, today, it's part of the privilege I have of teaching now young people some of what I know about that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. Hello.
Good afternoon, Dr. Jones. My name is Michelle Taylor. First of all, I'm extremely excited to be here today. It's learning about the fact that you have ancestral ties to Central Kentucky really got me excited to start reading the book. And I'm about halfway through, and in one of the chapters you talk about your grandmother and her friendship with Caroline Bonday. So my background is anthropology, public history. So I wanted to know more about how was that experience for you going to see, to give some background for those who hadn't read it. Your grandmother was a part of a study and her hair was examined. So these early 1900 race, the studies like the Bertillon, or in this case, the hair. So you talked a little bit about it, but now that you've, went and saw it, do you think that, would you have wanted to take the sample home, or like, what was that? Could you go into a little bit more detail about your own ancestors, hair, or, biological samples being a part of a study?
Yeah, thank you for that. So Caroline Bonday is an anthropology student at Harvard in the 1920s. Her question is one that emanates from her own experience and the experience of her family. She is challenging an old and pernicious theory called mulatto degeneracy, a theory that had posited that mixed-race people were biologically inferior, likely to die at younger ages, and over time to be unable to procreate. And so Bonday studies hybrid people, which is the language of her time, to not only establish that they are hybrid people, so to speak, but that they are not degenerated in any way. And among the subjects in her study, it includes W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois fills out one of her questionnaires, and so does my grandmother, who was a young mother herself in North Carolina in those periods. And Bonday was an old-fashioned physical anthropologist. She measured skulls. She created genetic descendant charts. She examined hair samples, all looking for evidence of race and racial composition. Most of her, no, I say all of her techniques are today discredited, but they were still ascendant in her time. So she asked my grandmother to give a sample of hair, and a colleague and dear friend, the historian Adele Logan Alexander, a descendant of Caroline Bonday, says to me in a note, "I think I found a letter from your grandmother here. I think you should come look." And it takes me some years, but I go to look, and not only is there a letter from my grandmother to Caroline Bonday, a very warm letter that reflected their friendship, but there are hair samples that are still in the collection of the Peabody Museum at Harvard. I think that the update to, or more context than what I'm able to offer in the book, is that it's really harrowing for me and very unsettling to go see the hair, and I have this urge to in essence, to steal it. Now, I say that in a museum, and I'm sure I'll be barred for life, but I really feel like I shouldn't leave it there, but I do, because I'm a respectable professional. It's in that moment when Harvard is actively re-examining itself, because among the human remains in the Peabody collection are the remains of Native Americans, and also of enslaved people. And yet, I think that my grandmother's hair doesn't quite fit with the broad rethinking that says human remains should be repatriated. They were taken by force. They were taken illegitimately. They were taken, by way of exploitation. Well, Caroline Bonday was a black woman anthropologist, and my grandmother was a young black mother, and they were friends, and she sent Caroline Bonday her hair. And I'm not sure if it's of the same, I'd be interested to know what you think, if you think it's of the same category as other, rightly contested human remains that are being deaccessioned and returned to families and communities by Harvard. I haven't asked for the hair. Someone did ask me once if I would like to have it. I didn't have an answer because I didn't think I had a cultural context for what to do with it.
I was grappling with that question as well because through my both personal genealogy research and as an anthropologist, I came across an ancestor who was put in prison, and they did the Bertillon system. So when you look through the records, it had dimensions of all the skeletal features, and I felt like, that had also been disproven over time, and I see where I agree with what your initial thoughts are about it. I'm still grappling with it myself, but I see it's a fair conversation, like, for descendants to have a say-so in what happens. Like, I don't think it's too far out of reach to say if you want to have it repatriated to individuals, it should be an open conversation. Like, I personally would rather it be in an institution that keeps it preserved, but it's complicated.
It's complicated, right?
It is.
It really remarkably, I did an event in Baltimore a few weeks ago with a wonderful colleague, an anthropologist named Elgin Klue. And Elgin Klue is a scholar and, a professional in his own right, but his family's hair is also in the Peabody Museum collection, it turns out. And I thought maybe we need to create a descendant community where we deliberate collectively. We might agree, we might not agree, but I think it's hard, as an individual, in like individual families, to have enough context to know how and what it is you might want and what the stakes are. But I think, so now I'm putting it out there, if anybody else is descended from folks whose ancestors are in that Carolyn Bonday collection, I think it would make for a very interesting and important set of reflections, I think, for Black folks generally, right, about where we sit in the in this important and highly contested scene of the repatriation of human remains, because I think that we are overlooked still in too often times in those discussions. And that's why I don't really have an answer, because I feel like we haven't thought about it enough. So thanks so much for that.
Thank you so much.
Send those folks my way. Huh?
Will do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. On behalf of the Family History Center staff, we want to thank you so much for returning to us again. And folks, thank you so much for coming out today. Please join Dr. Jones on the second floor, on the level 1, outside the museum shop for the book signing. It will be starting in about 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.